Hey, I feel like I'm getting maybe a little bit more comfortable in front of the camera, so I guess that's good. Today we're going to talk about Equiano. One of the things that I think is probably the most important, I only made you read just a small portion of it because I really wanted to look at his childhood and obviously the middle passage. So the other stuff, I think it's really good reading, but I like this part more because that's the most questionable part. Okay, so first thing I want you to do is make sure that you look at the PowerPoint that I also put in the lecture section. It's really, really helpful and it provides a ton of information. So what I'm going to do today is I want to look at a few things from his childhood that I think are relatively questionable and see what you think. Okay, so number one, on page 690, we have Equiano. He's a little kid, right? And he gets kidnapped. Okay, keep in mind that at this point it was other Africans who were kidnapping, and then they would take them to the boat. And so basically he was with Africans until he got to the boat. So keep that in mind when you're kind of thinking about this. But anyway, on page 690, one of the things we have is he says, actually, I've got my little paper here, that he says he was trained up from his earliest years in the art of war on page 690. So, my question is, and I know it's a little kid talking or from a kid's perspective, but my question is, if he was trained in the art of war, how was he kidnapped so easily? I mean, he says basically he was kidnapped with no time to resist whatsoever. So, I don't know. And then, also on page 690, also very questionable, I mean, they had talked about, actually in the paragraph before, they had talked about how they had known a kidnapper was in the area. A kidnapper tried to come into the area. So then, why do the parents leave the kids to get kidnapped? It's just questionable. And really, they actually made a point of saying that they stayed together in groups to keep from being kidnapped. But this time, they weren't together. And I'm like, okay, that seems really questionable to me. So, that, I don't know enough about this one to actually question it too much, but they seem like they were treated relatively well up into the boat. And actually, Equiano specifically was treated pretty well on the boat. We'll talk a little bit more about that. I don't know how likely I feel that is. Maybe not so much, but I mean, basically it seemed like he was taken into people's families, even though he was a slave to them. So I was a little bit there, but again, I don't know exactly how that would have worked. Okay, one of my favorites, the chicken. Okay, it's on page 691 if you don't remember it, but the chicken story. Okay, so basically what happens is Equiano has already been kidnapped at this point. He's been kidnapped, and he throws a tiny pebble at a chicken and hits the chicken in the exact spot that it kills the chicken. So I'm wondering, I mean, is he holding a boulder and he just drops it on a chicken? I mean, it just does not make sense to me. That to me, I was like, well, that didn't happen. Because I cannot imagine, the accuracy it would take to kill said chicken. I think the chances are 1 in a million. And even then, when he runs away. He thinks he can use the sun to get home. Maybe, I don't think little kids can do that. Also, he made it seem like it was like the most terrifying place on earth. Maybe it was, and again, it was from a kid's perspective, so maybe I'm being a little hard on him. I think that's fair, though. If we really need to question his authority. On page 693, he tells us that he learns a bunch of different tongues. So basically what that means is he learned a bunch of different languages. Now, I have a few things here. I don't think he learned a number of languages. It doesn't seem like this took like years and years. This probably took like a month or two, maybe a couple months to get to the ocean. So I don't know that it would have taken that long, that he would have been able to learn 2 or 3 languages. I feel like he might have been picking up dialects instead, but 2 or 3 languages, I don't know. I know he's a kid, and I know kids can learn languages a little bit easier, but still, 2 or 3 sounds suspicious. Okay, and then another one, I know you're like, God, she has a lot. Another one that I like, and this one's so creepy and weird, and I love it, of course. He meets back up with his sister. The chances of him meeting back up with his sister, I would think actually are pretty good. They're both kind of heading to the same place, so maybe, I would say, not likely. I would say it's still unlikely that would happen, but not impossible. Okay, but I think, and I don't even know if I just think this is just weird, that he and his sister, we have this weird scene. So he meets back up with his sister, and the people who kidnapped him actually were pretty nice. And then he lets them sleep together in this really bizarre way. So basically, it's Equiano, his sister, they sleep holding hands across some weird grown-up. Ugh, it's so creepy. I don't know. I don't know. I just think, I don't even know that seems unlikely. It just seems insane. And what a weirdo. The guy in the middle. Right? Okay. So, also, if you read through it, and go back, and you don't have that much reading for this thing, so go back and really read it. It seems like he goes into great detail at some points and not so great detail at other points. For example, when he is in the bush there after he runs away because he kills the chicken, he describes that in great detail. But then probably the most important thing about this piece was the Middle Passage. And for those of you who don't know, the Middle Passage was the boat ride that the slaves took across the ocean to North America. But he describes the Middle Passage, and that's really, really important. But if you look at actually how many pages he uses to do it, he doesn't do it justice at all. I mean, he describes it in like a couple paragraphs, maybe a page, but it seems like he goes on and on about some other things. So it's interesting how he goes on, and then a really important thing he doesn't talk a lot about. Now, people have said, well, Middle Passage could have been really, really traumatic for him, and I agree, it could have, but again, he wasn't treated that badly, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. One of the things with the Middle Passage, though, was, according to other sources, like if you read any histories of the Middle Passage, his description seems relatively accurate, although short. It seems relatively accurate. So, that makes me believe him a little bit more. And then his treatment on the boat, if you think about that too, that actually seems relatively accurate as well, that they wouldn't have necessarily kept him down below. Because you have to think, Equiano was around 12 years old when all this happened. So he's 12 years old. So if they treated this 12-year-old, who seems like he would probably be a moneymaker, right? Because he was a young man who could have been strong, healthy, and he seems strong and healthy in here. So if they hurt him, basically they were losing money. So that could have been one of the reasons he was up top. Still, smidge unlikely. Okay, so these are just a few that I have. I think there are a ton more in here. I love this piece though. So now, we've kind of done this. We've kind of looked at some of the questionable things. And look at that PowerPoint because it actually kind of looks at both sides. Okay, well, this is questionable, but this is what could have happened. So it's a great PowerPoint. But the thing that we really need to talk about right at the end is, okay, does it matter? Does it matter if he's telling the truth? Because he may not be telling his truth, but he is telling somebody's truth. And he is telling a relatively accurate story of what happened from being a child in Africa, being kidnapped, and going across the Middle Passage. So he was relatively accurate, actually much more than relatively accurate. There are just a few parts, and actually these parts to me are details, you know, they're not the plot line, so that are just a little bit questionable. So look at that. Then ask yourself, does it matter at all? I don't know. Some of my students say, yeah, it matters, because if he wasn't telling the truth, then this story is not great. And then I have some students who are like, but it is somebody's truth. And if it is somebody's truth, he was literate. He was literate when a lot of people were not literate, and getting it out there actually could have been more important, like supersede his story, or him writing his own story. So, I don't know, think about it. That's really the purpose of this class, so think on it, and I'll talk to you soon. Thanks, bye.